Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this live interview with the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovations. My name is Oscar Wales. My colleague Sophie Chedri and I will be moderating this live discussion. Today we will be talking with Emilbek, an Associate Professor of International and Comparative Politics at the American University of Central Asia. Professor Jurayev completed his Master's in Political Science at Indiana University in 2002 and has recently finished his PhD in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland. His past research has included topics such as the role of NGOs in Kyrgyzstan's development, small arms control in Central Asia, as well as ethnicity and education in Kyrgyzstan. Today we will be discussing the implications of leadership change in Central Asia and its implications for regional security.
Okay, before we start with the discussion, here is a little information about the Institute. So the Bulan Institute for Peace Innovation is a non-profit and non-governmental organization that aims to promote peace, mitigate and prevent conflict, and build dialogue in Kyrgyzstan and other Central Asian states. So we conduct peace-centric research, provide independent expert analysis, and organize public events. If anyone watching has any questions for the professor, please post them in the comment section and we will do our best to answer them.
Okay, so thank you for joining us. So, as we know, in Central Asia there have been several long-serving presidents who have been in power for 22, 23 years. As they are becoming older, this poses the question of power transition, especially after the death of Uzbekistan President Islam Karimov. This question is even more relevant. So we want to start with an overview. What is the possible scenario for long-serving presidents in Central Asia? For instance, Emilbek. He recently appointed his son to a new position as mayor of Dushanbe. Is it possible that he's preparing to pass down power to his son?
Yeah, very important question. I think our succession in Central Asia has been one of the most burning issues in recent years among students of Central Asia. As you're quite pointed out, has become even more important with the passing of the people. Well, I think what happens in Uzbekistan these days, and say 1 or 2 years forward, it would be very important for us to have a better idea of what else is going on, how some scenarios might play out in this society. Now you mentioned Tajikistan. President Emilbek indeed has introduced some changes to the constitution recently that made it possible for
Now that's that sound.
Now we're
Just trying to make the sound a bit better.
Yeah, that's the wonders of the latest new technology, right? Communications. Now, so a number of introduced changes in the constitution that made it possible for President Emilbek to, for himself, stay in power for as long as he wishes, and also to get his son to replace him as a leader of the country at the nearest coming elections. And my hunch is that he has absolutely that idea is precisely what he is to prepare his son to be the next leader. And potentially I even have a wild guess that because his son is relatively young now and the age bracket has been lowered in the constitution precisely to put him as a potential candidate in the upcoming elections, I think he may give him the position of the presidency while he's also the senior leader of the nation standing behind him. Because President Emilbek himself is relatively young too. He's just past 60. And by any indication, he's able to go on for quite some time on. And considering how much control he has already established over the country politically, considering how much his family has already completed his role family of government, I think he has all the possibility to give that practical experiment. For example, letting his son run and win the next presidential elections, taking a step back, much like President Putin did, and then just come back or see thereafter.
Would we find the same scenario in Kazakhstan? And how could Nazarbayev assure a smooth power transition to a possible successor? Again, thinking about his daughter, Daria, who also has a special status.
Exactly. Yes, in Kazakhstan, much more than in Emilbek or
We're just being asked to speak a little while.
Yeah. Yeah. Much more than Emomali Rahmon or President Berdi Muhamedov of Turkmenistan. I think the question is much greater urgency in Nazarbayev's case in Kazakhstan. After the passing of his, as he liked to call his friend, President Karimov in Uzbekistan, I think everyone has been observing this activization in the in political life of the country that looks like some sort of fidgety, not quite so clear, but nonetheless a preparation to for the succession. Now, little is known as to exactly who is going to really replace President Nazarbayev, and his daughter Dariga is certainly a top political official for some years now. But there are serious reasons to think she may not really be the pick for presidential replacement. But she's still a potential. And then, of course, there are a number of prominent other politicians in the country. The more interesting thing that I think motivates President Nazarbayev these days is to make sure that in the event of his sudden leaving of the stage, his legacy, especially the legacy for his family, is not as dark or is not so bad as it turned out to be for the rest of England's family. I think in Uzbekistan, the memory of President Karimov will be kept quite high and nice, but what really happens to his family, daughters, his wife. I think that's been something of a worry for President Nazarbayev as he projects that on his own.
What would the security implication of power transition in Kazakhstan be?
Well, with any power transition, there's always an opening of all sorts of potential security threats. Right? Just before the eventual change took place in Uzbekistan, and everyone talking about the succession in Uzbekistan was raising a number of potential issues. For example, the activization of what is said the Islamic opposition that has been suppressed in the country for the whole tenure of President Karimov by force, that with his departure they may try and use the opportunity, the vacuum and power to get back into some sort of recognition. There were also concerns about the regional interaction relation between these countries. With Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan may get into conflicts of any degree because of the domestic situation. The new administration, the new power may require some sort of an external challenge, external threats in order to mobilize support and legitimacy inside. Now what we see is a relatively smooth transition to relief of most of those people who are worried. Now in Kazakhstan's case, I think we have less worry to harbor in terms of their regional implications, but certainly as with any transition of power in the case of such long-serving and authoritarian style regimes, the possibilities for some anarchy, some disruption in the political life of the country are pretty high. And unlike in Uzbekistan, for example, relatively there is still some hidden or underground or relatively even known oppositional or critical forces in Kazakhstan. So it's not something that the Kazakh society will find completely strange place should such a scenario.
Okay, so we've already touched on this a little bit, but could you please elaborate on the situation in Uzbekistan at the moment? Have you seen any signs that the new Uzbek president could be an improvement on Karimov and could possibly make democratic changes? For example, he recently released several long-serving political prisoners from prison.
Indeed. Ever since President Mirziyoyev stepped into power, initially for several months, of course he was the interim president, I think he gave a lot of hope, a lot of positive expectations to pretty much everyone, including the population inside the country, to the citizenry of Uzbekistan, to neighbors, to other countries around the country, and to some extent the organizations for human rights, civil rights around the world. Now, of course, it would be very easy to just get carried away by a lot of these seemingly positive vibes. Of course, it would be very difficult for Uzbekistan to genuinely become a liberty-embracing, rights-observing sort of country regime very quickly. And of course, President Mirziyoyev has not had the sort of experience or the sort of background that would suggest him to be able to move that, or to be even interested to move in that direction. But based on a number of things, such as the release of a few long-term political prisoners, politically charged prisoners, some journalists, the fact that he has opened up some more direct communication lines with the population to find out exactly what they feel or what they think to be the problems they urgently need resolving. He has introduced some sort of an I think open public space, public discussion space, and whether that materializes into actual changes in the way the country runs its politics, its economy, well, remains to be seen. But I think it would be illegitimate, it would not be founded on any good reason to deny the possibility of any change. Well, and one negative change is kind of negative reason to think he may bring some easing up of the authoritarian style of Karimov left. Is just the difficulty of picking up and going on with the style that Karimov showed us for a young and newcomer. The process of getting someone elected, right? Of course, President Atambayev has repeatedly, many times, has reassured that he does not have any plans to leave an actual successor to himself in the manner of, for example, Azerbaijan, for example, or even Russia, for that matter. That is, there's no one who has been groomed to be the new president when President Atambayev completes his first and only term. But still, politicians being rational and the government being very rational, it's hard to expect. Nobody seems to quite fully believe that President Atambayev will completely just abandon the electoral process to free choice and free competition of all the aspiring politicians. Now, of course, there will be somebody, one or more candidates put forward by the presidential party, the Social Democratic Party of Kyrgyzstan, which the President has acknowledged to be basically his party. So, who that party picks is probably going to be the one that the President will be most interested in getting into the office. Now, that said, of course, the elections promise to be very competitive, and and also very tense. The tension that has ultimately led to the recent imprisonment of this very prominent opposition politician, Emilbek has started already back in the fall of 2016 when the government pushed through a package of constitutional changes, right? And that has gone on, and of course, I think, unfortunately, the battle between the president and Mr. Tekebayev has gone well beyond the purely principled political sorts of debates, constitutional matters, over constitutional matters or electoral matters, into essentially mutual blame of the integrity of each other. Right? Whether President Atambayev is honest enough or good enough, as he says, or whether Deputy Mr. Tekebayev is clean and free from corruption that he claims to be. So in the end, I think, unfortunately, the population of the country has not gotten the sort of productive, constructive sort of debate between these two big players, and instead it has come down to this just criminally oriented row. Now, I think the presidential race is going to be very competitive nonetheless, and it will go on. There definitely will be some opposition politicians of different degrees. We have a number of already declared candidates, and some of them are more oppositional to the current regime, some are less. So we'll have the whole spectrum of people from the more radical to very moderate to kind of the peaks of the incumbents. So, but the most important thing is, at this moment, indeed, I don't think anyone can tell who will win, including the president.
Okay, so I would like to encourage our viewers now, if you have any questions, please ask them and they will show up in the comment section. But first, we have a question from Cholpon Orozbekova, the founder of our organization, and she asks, is Kyrgyzstan still an island of democracy, and does it have more freedom now compared to other countries, taking into account jailed politicians and pressure on journalists?
Well, it is very difficult to keep the sort of positive epithets that we tend to attach to Kyrgyzstan in the view of the things that are going on, right? However, I think just to remain analytically strict, I think, of course, we have, compared to the other countries, we have to admit that, just as I said, the very fact that President himself looks like he's still in some sort of a search, and his party doesn't seem to come to any decision on who to put forward as a candidate, is a good indication that there is competition. There is genuine competitive sort of politics that Kyrgyzstan still maintains. Now, it's a very unfortunate thing that the judiciary, the justice system, does get very often used for political purposes, or even if that cannot be certainly proven, then certainly the quality of production of justice has been systematically very problematic. And that's really something that everyone in the government and in the opposition recognize. Justice reform, rule of law reform has been going on for years, but nothing has been done. And of course, whenever necessary, in times like these, very tense sort of political seasons, we do get to see courts becoming part of the instrument, part of the recipe for fighting a political war. So indeed, that's a problem, but I think that still is a far cry from what our neighbors are able and do engage in terms of persecuting their oppositions and shutting down any critics and using any means possible, including the courts and the police and law enforcement, basically get their ways through.
Okay. We have
one question from one of the Facebook users. So what is the danger and risk of religious extremism in Kyrgyzstan? Should we be worried?
Should we be worried? Well, a very good question and a difficult question indeed, isn't it? I don't think any country so far in Central Asia or even anywhere around the world has come up with a clear answer of how to deal with the threats of radical religious movements. Terrorism is something that all countries are worried equally, and they're all equally puzzled as to exactly how to fight it. Now, one thing we do know is police methods and generally law enforcement and punitive sort of methods of fighting religious radicalism is ineffective. And I think in Kyrgyzstan there has been that understanding, and a number of organizations in cooperation with the relevant agencies in the government have been trying to formulate a policy that is wide-ranging, that includes education, raising awareness, working very closely with the legitimate sort of religious institutions, the mosques, the muftiyat of Kyrgyzstan, to get basically the word to the youth, to the potential, the most likely recruits to by the radical movements, that there is the sort of Islam, the sort of religion, we're talking obviously in Kyrgyzstan, we're talking about Islam, that there is the sort of Islam that we are embracing, that we tolerate and welcome. And then that there are other subversive, wrong ways of the dogma that have been taught and proselytized that we do not accept. So I think what we are doing is just potentially right at the beginning, we're not doing very much of it though. Kyrgyzstan and any other country needs to understand much more seriously and come up to it in a much more well thought and forceful way, and not leave it as a secondary issue to something else and live with it.
Okay, so we don't have any more questions from our viewers yet, but we have another question here. So water scarcity. So this has become a big source of friction between some Central Asian states. Dams in the upstream countries of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan make the downstream countries of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan concerned because of the potential lack of water supply during the summer.
Right.
Uzbek and Tajik relations have deteriorated because of the Rogun Dam in West Tajikistan, the construction of which has been a major source of contention between the two countries and remains unresolved. What are or could be the implications for regional security in that matter, particularly following Karimov's death?
Yeah, there seems to be some sort of a positive dynamic in this regard. President Mirziyoyev, ever since he came into the office, has made it very clear that he intends to improve the relations with the countries in the region, specifically with the neighboring countries, and that has been in part interpreted as his openness to negotiating over these highly controversial and previously very conflict-prone projects of dam construction, hydroelectric dam construction. President Rahmon of Tajikistan has taken it seriously, I think, and it has moved on with launching in a very ceremonial event in Dushanbe, in Rogun, at the site of the place, launched the construction of the dam itself. It's been there. I mean, the Rogun Dam itself is, of course, a design left from the late Soviet times. But yeah, he late in the fall of 2016 he launched it, and so Tajikistan has been actively in the process of doing this project, carrying out the project. Uzbekistan has been silent in this case, right? During President Karimov's reign, you would not have Tashkent just sitting silently and watching this. In Kyrgyzstan, of course, we have not yet done anything. There has been a delay due to a fallout with the investors from Russia. President Atambayev, a year ago, 2 years ago, had to just walk away from that contract because the project was not moving forward. Now, regardless, the intention in Kyrgyzstan remains that we do want to build that Kambarata station, and Atambayev has invited very openly, once more, for Uzbekistan to take part in this project, to actually be a stakeholder rather than try to subvert it or stop it somehow. So I think there's potential for some understanding, because a good part of this debate was indeed, in my perception, not so much about the tectonic, seismic concerns, but rather political and economic concerns of Uzbekistan. And those are solvable. And people can come to a compromise, to some agreement, and some ways of a mutually acceptable way of doing the dams. Right? And more generally, I think if those sorts of issues can be solved, then more generally the water resources of the region, which have been one of the more thorny conflict reasons for conflict of all these countries, I think they're all solvable. Right? It just takes the right sort of attitude from all of these countries, that an understanding that any sort of conflict, any sort of inability to cooperate between these close-lying neighbors is only yet another major reason for insecurity and long-term dangers for each.
Okay.
Okay, new question from our Facebook user. So the first one, to what extent is the EU playing a role in addressing, mitigating, or perhaps ignoring the consolidation of dictatorship in Central Asia?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, isn't it, Khalida? Well, not tricky. Now, I'll say, indeed, I think systematically we've heard criticism of both the European Union, the United States even more, and generally the international community of countries not being tough enough, not being critical enough of the regimes who tend to systematically ignore human rights, and more than that, they openly break them, violate them. I think the EU, of all the potential other government-based political actors, I think EU has been somewhat consistent, even though very mild, in its criticism of human rights records of these countries. Now, we just always need to be realistic, right? What can EU really do? What is the weight? What is the political capital that EU has in order to effect any sort of change that is beyond the acceptable level for these dictatorships? Now, I think that said, I think for both the European Union and anyone else, I think you raise a very good question at the right time, for example, for Uzbekistan, because the most reforms, the most dramatic, positive as well as negative, of course, reforms can be done in the earliest stages of a new coming administration, new leadership. So I think it would be a wonderful thing for any interested actors, including the non-governmental, civil society internationally, to work with, to try and work with President Mirziyoyev and his team to get them agree, to get them see the practical benefits of leading a more liberal, a freer sort of political regime. So this might be a better time to improve that record, which so far has been quite a bad record during the President Karimov's times. Okay.